Welcome home. We are WNST, Tassel, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We're taking the Maryland Crab Cake Tour on the road throughout the holiday season. Crab cakes for Christmas. Crabs for Christmas. It's all brought to you by the Maryland Lottery. Got these Raven scratch-offs to give away. I'm going to have some scented tickets to give away a little later on. Our friends at Window Nation, 866-90Nation, and Jiffy Lube Multicare. You can find out all the Crab Cake Tour dates out there. Coco's, Fadley's, State Fair, Curio and Foreign Daughter, Wise Markets. We're doing it all during the month of December, but it's basketball season, right? Terps got off to sort of a lousy start here to get things going, and I even looked up the Wizards record, and it's abysmal at this point. So, we don't get to talk as much basketball here, and I'm old school. When a Muggsy comes on, I'm ready for it. When Keith Booster, I'm ready for it. Any of the old Maryland guys, I'm ready for it. But this is a book about a Boston basketball background. It's not lost on me that Gary Williams spent some time in Boston, spent some time out in Ohio, but he does feel like ours. I mean, he went to college here, the whole deal, the name on the floor and all that. So when it came across my desk that Clayton Trutor had written a book called Boston Ball that features a very young and handsome Gary Williams on the cover, as well as Jim Calhoun and Rick Pitino, the forgotten cradle of basketball coaches in Boston. First things first, I love having PhDs on. Anybody that's a doctor other than Dr. Pepper, Dr. J, I like having those folks on. Clayton Trutor is an author and a PhD as well, teaching people things, but certainly teaching a little history of Boston basketball. And very, very interesting that a Baltimorean and Reggie Lewis is on the front of the cover as well. So there's a whole Baltimore thing happening here. I think it was Len Bias's birthday the other day, so I always have this Maryland thing happening here. Clay, congratulations on getting another book done. I know you're one of those struggling doctor-author types here, but when I saw the Gary Williams connection, I thought, you know what? I'm going to learn something here. So welcome on. A pleasure to have you on the program, man.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Well, you write a book on this Boston background, and I see these legendary guys and thinking, oh, yeah, they were all there together. And, I've been doing this for 32 years here, and we had various young guns here at different times. Dino Gaudio was at Loyola at one point. We had several of the Loyola coaches here went on to greater things. Skip Prosser, some other folks that coached here locally. We've had these miraculous Cinderella March Madness stories with Coppin and Fang Mitchell. Of course, a couple years ago with UMBC, with the son of a coach, an ACC coach as well. But we love our basketball around. It's a great tradition. And I don't want to say I don't think of Boston basketball as having tradition, but I mean, first thing I thought is Reggie Lewis going up to Northeastern, and there has been a little bit of a Boston-Baltimore thing. But tell me about your book, because, I mean, you're really going back a couple, 3, 4 decades here and finding sort of a piece of Boston basketball history that translates not just here, but Connecticut and everywhere Rick Pitino's been.
Yeah, I mean, the book started, I was in graduate school in Boston at the time. I got my PhD at Boston College, and I'm a basketball junkie, so I would regularly go to all the college games in the area. And it occurred to me that 3 different Hall of Fame careers started roughly at the same time in Boston. You have Jim Calhoun at Northeastern, Rick Pitino at Boston University, and Gary Williams at Boston College, all in very early chapters in their careers. And I got each guy's autobiography and read them, and it struck me as really surprising that none of them spent much time talking about this era. Gary Williams spends 4 pages on his 4 seasons at BC. Rick Pitino spends 3 pages on his 5 years at Boston University. And Jim Calhoun, who spent his first 14 seasons at Northeastern, spends a chapter and a couple of pages on that. So it struck me as something that deserves some scrutiny and somebody to actually write about it, because all these things were happening simultaneously, and these guys went on to such remarkable careers.
I find that when anybody's writing a book about something relatively esoteric, it's because there's something missing and something that they got to get out in that. I mean, I thought The Shining portrayed it very well with Jack Torrance, all work and no play. And, like, I've written 4 books. I'm a very type A, gregarious, outgoing. I'm not an introvert at all. It's a very introverted process to begin this. I would think the first thing when you would say for any of these guys is if I sat and had beer with Gary Williams, or 2 or 3, and talked about that era, he probably would have a lot to say about a kid he recruited, a kid he lost, how it helped him get the next gig, what he learned at American before he got there, the the money floating around back then, the cocaine floating around back then, the problems with the kids floating around, the wild, wild west that it was at that particular point for sure. Um, and I guess for how many sort of legendary players basketball was built in that era. I had 2 weeks ago I had Lazenby on talking about the Magic book,
Mhm.
same era, say late 70s, early 80s, where kind of the NBA and March Madness as we know it really got reconstructed by Magic and Larry Bird, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this is college basketball is in such transition in this period. You go from having a 25 team tournament in the mid 70s to having 64 teams starting in 1985. Really, still the core of what exists now. You have the 3-pointer coming in during this era. You have a shot clock. So the makings of modern college basketball are all taking place
And
in this era.
conference play, like in a big, like Big East became like this thing,
Absolutely.
and conferences weren't necessarily that way when it was John Wooden taking on Houston at the Astrodome, right?
Certainly, yeah, and particularly in the East, you had this big amorphous thing called the ECAC, which was sort of a conference and really almost like an organization of all the colleges in the area. When the Big East breaks away, all hell really breaks loose. Everybody's looking for a conference. BC, where Gary Williams is, only gets into the Big East because Holy Cross, who'd historically been a power, turned them down. They felt it wasn't in the mission of the institution. They wanted to remain an academic school. BC was happy to jump at it. They wanted a team in the Boston market because of the Boston Garden being there. That was one of Dave Gavitt with the Big East's big ideas. He wanted to have access to all the big arenas, Madison Square Garden with St. John's, in Philadelphia with the Palestra and the Spectrum, with Villanova having access to it, having teams in all the big
Well, and
cities and all the big
Georgetown at the
arenas.
Capitol Center
The
as
capital,
well. Yeah,
absolutely, yeah.
sure.
Georgetown, the Capital Center, certainly, yeah. So that's an important part of the story too. Northeastern and BU, where Calhoun and Pitino are coaching, are also trying to figure things out. There's this kind of marriage of convenience called the ECAC North, which has like the Northern New England state universities, the Boston area schools, and then a couple of Buffalo schools get crammed together in one conference, and that's who's fighting it out during the context of that book. This book, that league barely even exists anymore. It's called the America East. UMBC is one of the good teams in it, Vermont, but it has
It
almost
was
nothing
always
to do
tough
with
beating
anything.
Canisius. Don't make fun of my Buffalo people.
Oh, but Canisius and Niagara play a prominent role in the book. Yeah, they kind of got screwed over by St. Bonaventure, who left to join the Eastern Eight that became the Atlantic 10. So they were hustling for a conference.
Yeah, I mean, and it still is Wild Wild West, but in a different way. And I say it out loud all the time, like they've lost me. Like this paying players and paying some of them and the boys and the girls and the Title IX. We have money here. We don't have money there. We're going to close this program. We're gonna go all in and give a whole bunch of money to a kid and have him come and what Miami's basketball program. I'm not. Look, there was always illicit stuff going on, but it's much harder to like sort of cut through this and get back to where you were 40 years ago, which is this is the way it was. But the way it was the way it was for a long, long time. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
the one thing we left out in all of this in the early 80s that really made all three of these guys in the end was television, right?
Oh,
Television was it
absolutely. I
was
mean,
it that
ESPN
didn't
makes the
exist in
Big East.
1973 when it was Maryland getting bounced out by NC State. Didn't exist in the same way as it did in 1983 when Valvano's run. I mean, just a sea of change for those of us that witnessed it, that were alive during that period. Because I'm one of the old
Absolutely. The
folks.
Big East of the ACC did great on ESPN in the early years of it. Those guys were getting seen all over the country in a way that never existed before. You took what was very much a regional sport and made it a genuinely national one. And I think that played a big role in making March Madness possible. Talking about all the issues with college basketball now, for me as a fan, I find the transfer portal the most confusing part of it, that you never know who's going to be on what team. I think one of the great things of that television era was Patrick Ewing, Chris Mullen. Those guys seemed like they were in college for 9,000 years. I mean, if you're a kid in the early 80s, they're on those teams as long as the guys in the Lakers and Celtics had been on their teams. So you had a genuine connection watching those guys year in and year out. That's very tough now. Even if a guy is great for 1 year, it's a very different relationship you have as a fan to them than seeing them progress over the course of 4 seasons.
I think it changes your relationship to the university a little bit too. I told a story a couple weeks ago. I had my old science teacher George Schulin on, and Luke, my partner, was on. And Luke was born in '83, so I'm trying to like help him out a little bit because sometimes he feels like an old fart, and then sometimes I want to burp him. And I remember my teacher, the late great Dave Fantasia, who we honored, was my science teacher in seventh grade, 1979. And I remember coming into his class and on his desk, and this is a plug for our Toyota dealers that have supported our show for 20 25 years here. They're still a great website sponsor, and Jay Pivick and everybody out there from Toyota. But in 1979, Toyota was sort of all in on ACC basketball. They were our sponsor, and they had a literal book that you would know as a Sporting News or an R Lads or an Athlons, a nice chunky, 98-page magazine dedicated to the ACC. And it had 8 pages on Maryland, 8 pages on State, 8 pages on Virginia. There's Jeff Lamp and Lee Raker, and there's, Buck Williams. And I go through all of it, right, in that era. And it was different. That's what I was raised on. And since then, it's never been as good in any way. But these coaches made hay, right? And they were at the smaller schools. When I mentioned Loyola here, or Coppin, or UMBC, Towson with, back in the day, Terry Truax, one of my favorite humans ever in any walk of life, the late, great Terry Truax, took me under his wing at Towson and trying to bring players in and compete. You talk about those little divisions and the ECC and the Big South and these other things that these teams were trying to get in. I would think that young version of Gary Williams, who played at Maryland, or Jim Calhoun, even Pitino, who always seemed to have big stars in his eyes, that they looked at that time, if you go back to that, it was like White Shadow, dude. It was just basketball. It was kids and basketball and winning and trying to keep these kids on the right side of the track, trying to get them to class, because that was important in a lot of places. Maybe not so much for NC State, but other places it was important. But for these small schools, it was love of basketball, right? I mean, this is where they grew their wings to be what they became, all three of these guys. And fighting around Boston for a bunch of kids to play ball, it probably was not just cutthroat, but you weren't getting the same players that John Wooden was getting.
No, certainly not. And that's a big aspect of this book, that they had to find different recruiting pipelines. In terms of getting guys like Reggie Lewis, Baltimore became a pipeline for Northeastern because they had some alums who ended up down there and ended up encouraging them to recruit players there. Pittsburgh was a big pipeline for them. BC got a ton of guys out of Connecticut before Calhoun gets there in UConn. I mean, they recruited 4 years in a row, recruited a guy who ended up in the NBA each year with the likes of John Bagley and Michael Adams, who had very good NBA careers.
Great Michael Adams. I saw him shoot it for the Bay State Bombardiers in the CBA. Come on now.
He was with the Washington Bullets for a while. Yeah, he was a fine player. And in terms of Pitino was a 5-star camp guy and was able to get a lot of guys through that pipeline as well. So the Boston area wasn't necessarily the richest area for players, although you certainly had Patrick Ewing coming out of there in that era, who ended up at Georgetown. There's also the issue, these schools, it's a very big men dominated college game by the late 70s. They weren't able to recruit the big men that the top programs were, so they ended up playing a very different style of basketball with a lot of fast breaking and pressing and trapping. And I think that's a big aspect of the book too, that stylistically you start to see the kind of small ball that existed in the late 20th and early 21st century in these programs in Boston. With relatively few people watching them, it was a nice laboratory for all of these coaches to try things out that they ended up making use of in their later stops.
Well, these three coaches in Pitino, Calhoun, and Gary Williams, for anybody joining us, by the way, the book is out. It's called Boston Ball. I'm going to pull it up off my my Twitter page here and show everybody, because I don't have the book in my hands, but there's a very, very young, sexy Gary Williams. There's a Pitino getting lifted to the rafters by his group, and there's like no fans in a little gym that looks like, I don't know, sort of the slap shot, minor league hockey gym. And there's Jim Calhoun down at the bottom. The author's Clayton Trutor. He is our guest. He's going to give you a code and do all this stuff that you can get the book. But the Gary Williams side of this, you just said Michael Adams. I don't have the book to finger through it. I had forgotten that Michael Adams played for him there, right? And then he goes to Ohio State. He had Jackson. He had some players there. But, people don't think about Gary's life before Maryland because, that's all there was. As far as people here, they just don't think about it. But Michael Adams played for him there, didn't he?
Yeah. He went to a pair of Sweet 16s when he was at Boston College. In 3 of the 4 years that when he was coaching at BC, they were picked 7th, 8th, or 9th in the Big East. They always finished above expectations. Throughout that era, because they didn't have the top popular recruits, they were always expected to be a much weaker team than they were. They came in and they could play with anybody in the conference. They just wore people out, playing so quickly, playing so aggressively on offense and defense. And Michael Adams was really the field marshal on the floor and probably the most significant player for them in that era. He only received one Division I offer. He was a kid out of Hartford, Connecticut. He'd been a Gold Gloves boxer, and a guy named Kevin Mackey, who later led Cleveland State to that big upset of Indiana in the '86
Kevin
tournament.
Mackey, yeah, there's a name, huh?
And Mackey's who discovers Michael Adams, brings him up to BC from day one. He's their starting point guard, and he's really the field marshal of that BC team in the early to mid '80s.
I'm going to get a Fennis Dembo reference in here. We're going to do it all. Clayton Trutor's here. The book is out. He's smiling. He's a basketball guy. I'm more of a basketball guy than I let on, huh? I know more than I think I know, huh? Maybe.
Oh, you sound like Red Auerbach talking. I don't know.
Yeah, it's all crazy. I get so for you with the book and the concept of putting the book together. Go Mork and Mindy here, and what have we learned here? What did you learn about it that made it compelling for you to go back into this and dig this up? Because the one thing I'll say for all three of these guys, a lot of these coaches, like I know Gary. Gary's crazy. I mean, I've known Gary 30 years. I mean, these guys are intense, high energy, all that stuff you talk about, that chip on their shoulder, always overlooked. Even when they've got castles and kings and driving Lamborghinis, they'll always be overlooked, underappreciated. Gary, the floor is named after him, but not the building, because it wouldn't be. They would never do that for me because I didn't win 2 championships. Because that's the way Gary is. Gary, to this day, when you spend time with him, you don't feel like he's even accomplished because he's always fighting. And I guess that's the street hustle for all these guys to take that sort of job, that even though they made it in the end and they did well, and Gary stayed along with Calhoun, they didn't really do anything else. Patino had all sorts of trails and entrails as well, through all of that. But I would say for them, that hustle that was in them, that hustle that made Gary a scrappy ball player, was kind of what served them. And they're kind of 3 peas in a pod to some degree to have built the college game the way they did.
Very much so. They're all incredibly competitive guys. One thing, I didn't talk to Patino, but speaking with Calhoun and Gary Williams, the degree to which they remembered the particulars of the lives of players they had 40 years ago was remarkable. They both remembered what these guys majored in. They remembered certain different aspects of their family and their personal lives and stuff. It really is striking how committed to the guys that played for them so long ago they remained, in both the case of Calhoun and Williams.
Especially when they coach so many kids.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I mean, but that's the nature of basketball, right? I mean, that's the love him, hate him about a Bobby Knight, is that he was in on your kid, and it was just him and the kids, and there's 12 kids on the floor. It was the White Shadow. There's nobody there, lights aren't on, and it's we need to beat North Carolina, and this is how we're going to do it. And I believed in all you, and I brought all of you here, and this is the role I have for you. And I'm the mad scientist genius on X's and O's, and how we're going to run a press and how we're going to run a system. To your point, you can't do any of that when you got kids 5 minutes and the player gives you the finger and says, I'm transferring to West Virginia. I'm going to go play for a different criminal.
It was a very different time, certainly, yeah, and the relationships were very different with the coaches and players, it seems like, too.
Yeah, well, I mean, that would be my feeling for it. If you spent that much time, it kind of reminds me of talking about my science teacher from 1979. My God, I remember everything about it, even though I can't remember what I ate for dinner last night. Clayton Trutor's here. He writes books. You've written a couple of books. Why this one? What about this dove you that night that the light went on? We're like, I'm going to do this, because I know how crazy it is to write a book.
Well, it happened kind of slowly over time. My first book was about Atlanta's pursuit of pro sports in the '60s, and then how it didn't quite turn out as they expected. It's called Loserville. It came out in 2022. After I'd finished that, is right around when the pandemic had started. The idea that these 3 coaches had been in Boston at the same time, it had been germinating in my head for several years. And the kind of lockdown type period was a perfect time for this, because everybody was at home, and I started calling people, and I cranked out 95 interviews in 3.5 months. And once you talk to one guy in these teams, they put you in touch with several other people. So it actually was a fairly easy book to write, in the sense of just getting the material. I mean, I already could go get all the newspaper stuff, but just in terms of talking with the people about their actual experiences, moving beyond the box scores, I think I couldn't have done it at a better time than when I did in 2020 and 2021.
Well, the book makes a perfect holiday gift. Before I give you a chance to pitch away, I'll just say this. When it came through, the Gary Williams thing, but the Michael Adams thing, and the Reggie Lewis thing, and the Baltimore Pipeline thing, boy, in the mid-'80s here for basketball, and Lefty and Bias and Bob Wade and all the Georgetown with John Thompson and Wingate and Muggsy going to Wake, and Sam Cassell winded up at Florida State. Just all of that era of the mid to late '80s and early '90s. And you can't write the history of college basketball without having a Baltimore connection,
Oh,
right?
without question, absolutely.
Give everybody a plug, man. Tell me how to get the book. It's digital too, right? You can do this for
Yeah,
Kindle, right?
you can get it on Kindle and everything. Boston Ball is available now from the University of Nebraska Press. You can save 40% off off the cover price going to bit.ly/Boston Ball, bit.ly/Boston Ball. If you use promo code 6AF23, you can save 40% off the cover price. That's bit.ly/Boston Ball 6AF23. You can also get it at Barnes and Noble and Amazon and all the other well-known online book retailers, but it'll cost a little more.
What years you go to Boston College?
I was in grad school there in the 2010s.
Oh, okay. This is real. You're young. Okay, it's real modern. You didn't seem that old to me. I thought you had a young old soul here in the PhD department, but I didn't know. I was gonna say, man, if you were like hanging out Boston College and like hanging out near Fenway Park in the during that era, that wasn't the greatest baseball. I mean, but when
No.
you were there, you got decent baseball. They were spending money by the time you had Theo Ball.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was in the heart of Theo Ball, certainly.
Well, tough to be a basketball fan in a baseball town at that time, but don't tell Bob Ryan that because every time he comes on, he reinvents the history of basketball for me. Really appreciate having on. You're like a PhD. What do you do in the real world? You're a teacher, right?
I teach at Norwich University, which is a small college in Vermont, and I freelance write for a lot of different publications and websites.
What do you teach?
I teach history, modern
Oh,
U.S. history.
nice. How's that going for you?
It's great. It's a fine institution to teach at. It's a military college, so a lot of the people I work with are soldiers in training. I also teach graduate students online, so it's a mix of those two.
I was just sort of making a tongue in cheek that like teaching modern United States history, which is sort of unfolding around us, isn't it? Every day,
Sure,
right?
by that I mean like post 1945, roughly. That's what I mean by that.
Oh man, kids today, God bless you, educators, every one of you. I've given great thanks to everybody. I had my high school principal on last week, the current high school principal, not my high school principal, passed away last year at Dundalk High. You can check all that out. We were at Costas on the Maryland Crab Cake Tour. It's all presented by our friends at the Maryland Lottery in conjunction with Win Donation and Jiffy Lube Multicare. The book is out. Make sure you go find Clayton Trutor out online. That is Trutor and Clayton, first name. Boston Ball is the book. Rick Pitino, Jim Calhoun, Gary Williams, and the Forgotten Cradle of Basketball Coaches, featuring man, Gary Williams looks like a movie star on that car. I can't believe he was ever that handsome. Looks like
Oh yeah, he
Tom
looks like
Selleck.
Clark Gable or something on there.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
looks like he should be set in he's got chiseled chin and all that stuff. I am Nestor. We are WNST AM 1570. A little football, a little bit of baseball, certainly some stuff on the lease, and even mix some college basketball in. So I'm feeling good about our 25th anniversary. Stay with us.